Hello and welcome to the next chapter of this mini series about how can we make a natural, realistic looking environment in Arnold for Maya. My name is Darko Mitev and this is Split Polygon, and let's dive right into this. So what you see here is a website called hdriheaven.com, and it is one of the best resources for HDRI maps on the market, and it's free. It's amazing. So I highly recommend you guys check this resource out. It has a lot, and I mean a lot of different HDRI images, and these are like, for those of you who don't know, an HDRI image is a almost panoramic look of a scene where you're at the moment, and you take um, the same image with a lot of different exposures on your camera. So you tweak the exposure and you snap, and then you make it brighter and brighter and brighter until you go to a full white, and then you do the opposite where you snap the same photo until you go to the full black, and then you can combine all of these images into one HDRI image, and that is a 32-bit image. Usually it can be 16-bit as well, but the more accurate ones are 32-bit images, and they are used by the VFX industry to light the scene so that the object that you try to integrate look like they are in that environment, right? So um, the guys from HRI Heaven are there's like amazing, so please check it out. And uh, Greg, he has a, what do you call it, Patreon page. So if you can, please donate and help him, because he's doing a great favor for all of us. So yeah, I've downloaded a bunch of HDRIs already, so you don't have to wait for me to do that. And I have a dome light. So if you go to Arnold lights and you click a sky dome light, which is basically what I have over here, and if I zoom out, it's basically Cambridge um, mapped onto a sphere. So a dome light is essentially a polygon sphere that is standing in the middle of our scene. And if I open the attribute editor, you see in the color, instead of picking a color, I click this icon over here and I've plugged a file texture. So the way you do that is, if I make a new one, so go light, sky dome light, you can make two of them. So if you go to color, you click this, it's going to bring up this new window, and you can say 2D textures, and you're going to find a file. You click file, and then you click and you browse and you find your HDRI where you saved it. All right, I'm going to delete that one. And this is pretty much how you're going to control the lighting of your shot. So a VFX supervisor on the set would go and it would take these kind of images, it would take these kind of shader balls, and if you remember this, you see these little shaders. This is pretty much telling you how this light is gonna render a glass, a Lambert object, a metal object, and a glossy plasticky object. So these are very important. This is something similar to what a VFX supervisor would do on a set. They even have like this color chart with different colors, and that is pretty much what all you need to judge if this HDRI is going to be good, or how the metal is going to look with this environment, and vice versa. All right, so when you plug that, you get there, and then you have your intensity. The resolution is not that important at the moment, so I'm just going to skip that. And then you have your exposure, your samples, which is by default set to 1, and then you have all of these parameters. So we're going to look at this in depth now. So I'm going to bring up the render view, and I'm going to start the render. So as soon as I do that, you're going to see our material start to react to the light. So this barrel already has a shader that has textures, and this is now reacting to the light. Now, what is the HDRI light doing, or the sky dome light? It's taking the colors from this image all around, and it's shooting rays towards the object, and it's bouncing them around towards camera, and that way this is receiving blue and green and red reflections and light, and it's lighting it as if this was there. Now, to make things a little bit more interesting, let's do something cool. Let's grab this ground plane. Let's say assign new material. Let's go to Arnold, and let's say what we do. Let's do shadow matte. If we do shadow matte, what's going to happen is the polygon plane will disappear, but the shadows will stay. If I move this, so if I move this around, you're going to see our barrel start to look like it's in the shot. It's very cool. All right, now obviously this is not how you would composite an object into a real life set. This is more so that you can see that if this object was to be rendered in a shot like this is the approximate, look of it. So yeah, it's not meant for you to render it like this and make it, look like it's standing in the courtyard of Cambridge or anything like that. But it's very useful as a tool to have. If you select the light and you rotate it, the light rotates around your object and your object stays the same. So you can see the exact same side of the object in a light or a dark situation. So just by rotating it around, it's picking up, you see the reflections on the ground, and the shadows change because the light is changing based on what we see. And then you have your exposure. If you want to make this brighter or darker, of course, like we saw, it's going to brighten up this, and also going to brighten up, how much light comes into the scene. If I set the exposure to 0.5, yeah, I think this starts to look good. And then these parameters are very interesting. This is, for example, if I take the camera, if I switch this off, the contribution of the light, it's still there. It's still lighting the scene as it is, but it's not visible in the render view anymore. All right, that's very important. And why is very important? If I click this alpha icon, see how this object is being cut out. So you can use this as a black and white mask in Photoshop or Nuke to combine this object into a real live action plate. So if this was black, you can just say everything that's black on the image, I want it to be transparent, and everything is white, I want it to be opaque. Now, if I don't do this, if my camera is set to 1, look what happens. My light is blocking the background. So right now, if I try to cut it out, I can't because my plane is over here. And because my plane has shadow matte material, it's showing like this. But if this was a Lambert or any other material, this would also, so it's going to be a pure white image. So what you need is to drop this back to 0. And now this is a lot easier to work with for compositing. While you work in your Maya scene, while you want to see how your shaders look, you can, work like this, but then you can turn it off for final rendering. All right, and these parameters control how much of these of the rays of this light affect the specular, the diffuse, the transmission being the refraction. So if I say diffuse is 0, all I see right now is the diffuse contribution, the color contribution of this light on the object is 0, which means that 0 diffuse bounces are happening on this object. If I crank this up, and if I say specular 0, that this is going to become a lot more dry object, meaning there's going to be no specular interacting with the shader of this object. Becoming a little technical, so I don't want to go too crazy, but this is pretty much a multiplier of your shader, of your material. We're going to look at this in a future chapter, but I just wanted to mention it here because we already have it. And this is volume and indirect illumination and that kind of stuff. But most of the time you're not gonna mess around with these too much, so I'm just gonna close this. All right. Now, what you can do is you can combine HDRI lights with a default, Maya light and Arnold lights. So if you go to Arnold lights and if you do an area light, and if I pause this for a second, so if I crank this guy up and we said that this was to be about 15, I remember, if I remember correctly, just be able to see anything. Oh, here's an interesting thing. Arnold caches the scene into memory. So if you do something and it doesn't show up, most likely, I'm just going to save my scene real quick. Most likely is Arnold is not picking up the changes you've made. All right, so sometimes you need to go to render, update full scene, and that's going to translate the entire scene, the objects, the lights, the materials, and then it's going to show up. So you see that light was not cached in, and when I added it, Arnold was like, I don't see it. Did you add a light? No, no. So you need to say, no, I actually did. Just recalculate your math, and it's going to show up. So now you're going to start to see something very interesting happening. So if I do something like this, and if I have a very crazy color on this, I can start to layer my lighting. So maybe I have an object over here that is emitting blue light, but this is still in a daylight environment. So now you can layer the lighting and get a lot more realistic and very specific kind of results. So maybe this was like a neon sign on the side is casting, purplish light towards the object, but it's still in Cambridge campus. So yeah, and another thing you can do, this is going to be slightly more advanced, but it's a very important one. So if I select the area light, I scroll down, you see the same parameters we talked about. Actually, let me show you something while we're here. So you see right now we don't see the area light. If I crank the camera to 1, now we see it. This is important because if you have the light visible in the scene at render time, if this was a reflective object, you're going to see a white reflection in your object plus the lighting contribution. But if this was not visible, all you're going to see is the lighting, but you're not going to see the light itself reflecting into the object. All right, that's a very important thing that I didn't mention when we were doing the 3-point lighting. Right, so now we have this light coming in here, but what if I want to break it up a little bit? I have a light filters. So if I click, I'm going to pause the render now. If I click add, you have a blocker and a decay. A decay is if you want to change how this light falls off. By default, Arnold has quadratic decay on the lights, but if you want to change that, or if you want this light to fall off a lot quicker, or if you want the intensity to stay a lot longer, then you can add this and tweak the decay. I'm going to add a light blocker for now, so I'm going to add a light blocker. Click that, and that's going to make a transform 1, and it's going to make a transparent cube. So I'm going to take this, I'm going to position it around my object, and I'm going to actually disable my HDRI just so we can see what the light blocker is doing. So I have the light, I'm going to bump up the exposure to 17 maybe so we see it full. Now we have a light blocker, but it doesn't block anything. Now why is that? Well, if you go to the light blocker, actually the easier way is just to select this over here. You have density and you have a shader. So if I say density is set to 1, you're going to see this is start to block the light. Now this is very interesting because now you can try to change this and you can start to add a lot of different interesting shadows coming in. So you can make a different, like you can make it a sphere. So maybe you can say, well, there's a spherical object just outside the camera. that is casting a spherical shadow. And then you have the height and the width ranges and the roundness. So if I crank this, is going to start to soften the effect. And you can also have a ramp, so it goes, you know, from one way, from one end to the other, and the axis is going to determine, you know, if it's going if the ramp is going on X, Y, or Z axis. So if I scale this guy up a little bit, and so this would be like an extreme light blocking, but usually with this you can be like, well, the density of this is like 0.5, so you can have like a slight shadow, or you can have a texture, so you can have like black and white map um, of, let's say, a branch, and it's gonna cast a branch kind of shadow on top of this. So very interesting way to control the lighting. So you can just block the light. If you have, for example, let's say you have this one hotspot of the object that is just too bright, you can just add a light blocker and just tone down the intensity of it just slightly, just so you know, art direct the light the way you want. And then you can just add back this guy. So if I add this one back and I start to dial in the intensity of the light blocker, you're going to see that effect over there. All right, so that was HDRI lighting. I'm gonna take this and take the camera back to 1. I'm gonna delete the blocker and the area light. And that was for the HDRI lights. In the next chapter, we're gonna look at shaders. How can we manipulate them to make different material properties? And yeah, it's gonna be a lot of fun. So see you guys in the next chapter, and thanks for staying in so far.